Okay, so you want to own a gladiator school. You picture a walled courtyard in a wealthy Roman city, rows of fighters drilling with wooden swords, armor hanging from pegs, and rich sponsors arriving to choose who will appear at the next public spectacle. Your school's name gets painted across town. Your best men become famous. Every event sends money back through your gate. That is the fantasy. The part the fantasy leaves out is that the arena is not your business. The crowd is not your customer. And the fighter standing in front of you is not valuable because he can die dramatically. He is valuable because you might be able to train him, advertise him, send him into real danger, and still have him walk back through your gate afterward. That is a much harder business. Before one man earns one payment, you have to acquire him, house him, guard him, feed him, train him, equip him, match him with the right opponent, transport him to the event, and repair whatever comes back. You have to do it while depending on wealthy sponsors, public permission, skilled trainers, reliable food, medical care, and the continued obedience of people your institution may have enslaved, condemned, captured, or bound under contracts so severe that even Romans compared them to slavery. And somewhere inside that system is a Roman contract with two completely different prices for the same fighter. One price if he returns, another if he does not. To understand why, start with the man who actually pays you. A gladiator school was called a ludus. The owner or manager was commonly called a lanista. The group of fighters attached to one operation could be called a familia gladiatoria, which sounds almost domestic until you see what it meant in practice. This was not a household in the ordinary sense. It was a controlled roster, and the lanista usually did not own the amphitheater. He did not stand at the entrance collecting coins from the public. He supplied fighters to the person staging the spectacle, a wealthy sponsor, a magistrate, a priest, an emperor, or someone else with the money and authority to put on the event. That person was the direct customer. The crowd consumed the show. The sponsor purchased what the show did to the crowd. A public spectacle could display generosity, satisfy a civic or religious obligation, attach a name to a major event, and create a visible relationship between the sponsor and thousands of spectators. That is why painted advertisements at Pompeii matter. They could announce the sponsor, the place, the dates, the number of pairs, and sometimes the group supplying the fighters. The wall did not simply say that combat was coming. It told the city who was making it happen. So when a sponsor arrives at your school, he is not buying violence by the pound. He is buying a public event that has to feel important before it even begins. Picture the negotiation. The sponsor wants a number large enough to impress the city. He wants recognizable veterans mixed with enough lesser-known fighters to keep the bill under control. He wants matchups that can be advertised in advance without knowing exactly how they will end. You want the famous names placed where they lift the value of the entire group, not exposed so recklessly that one afternoon empties your best rooms. The notice on the wall may carry the sponsor's name in the largest letters, but the promise underneath it depends on your roster. That means your first problem is not finding the strongest man. It is building the right roster. The people who entered these schools came from different legal conditions. Some were enslaved, some were captives, some were condemned, some were free volunteers known as octorati, men who entered contracts that placed their bodies under severe discipline and danger for a fixed term. Calling them volunteers can make the arrangement sound cleaner than it was. Their agreement carried disgrace, coercive authority, and the possibility of punishment that did not resemble a modern sports contract. From the school's point of view, all of these paths end at the same gate, but they do not produce the same fighter. A recruit can be strong and still be commercially useless. He may lack discipline. He may not fit the fighting categories your next customer needs. He may injure himself before his first appearance. He may panic under pressure. He may have no experienced opponent available, which means the sponsor cannot build the matchup he wants. Gladiators were trained in specialized styles with different equipment and expected pairings. You do not need every helmet and shield memorized to understand the economics. You need to understand the empty space on the matchboard. Say your sponsor wants several balanced contests. One experienced fighter is injured. Another has no suitable counterpart. Two novices are physically ready but not trusted in public. The yard is crowded. The event roster is not. A full school can still have very little to sell. Now add timing. The sponsor does not need every fighter on the same day. He needs the right fighters on one specific day. An injury that would be manageable next month can ruin this week's agreement. A veteran recovering behind a closed door still counts in your head count, still eats from your stores, and contributes nothing to the event being painted across town. That is where the compound itself begins consuming money. The school needs rooms for controlled accommodation, a practice area, storage for weapons and armor, food preparation, guards, administration, somewhere to treat injuries. At Pompeii, the building commonly identified as Gladiator Barracks contained accommodation and areas where armor and weapons were found. Centuries of Hollywood make the arena look like the entire institution. Economically, the arena is only the moment when all the hidden work is tested. The expenses arrive before that moment and continue after it. Picture one new fighter entering the school. He receives a place to sleep, though for many men it is also confinement. He begins training with wooden weapons. A specialist corrects his stance, his timing, the way he moves under equipment. Someone feeds him, someone maintains what he uses, someone watches the door. None of this creates revenue today. Tomorrow it happens again. And the recruit is not the only person consuming resources. A trainer cannot correct 10 men at once with the same attention. Armor made for one build may not fit another. A damaged shield has to be repaired before it becomes a danger to the school's own fighter. Guards are still needed on days with no event. Food does not become cheaper because the next sponsor has delayed his games. The school does not have a reliable surviving cost sheet telling us how many months this normally took, or what every private owner spent. But the operating problem does not depend on false precision. The recruit consumes food, time, labor, equipment, and security before a sponsor has any reason to put his name on a wall. The owner is therefore making a series of bets without calling them bets. Which novice deserves more time? Which injured veteran is worth treating for another appearance? Which fighter should be kept for a better customer instead of sent out now? Every answer ties more of the school's future to a body the owner cannot fully protect. Then the owner has to decide how much more to invest. That decision is visible in the food. Ancient evidence refers to a distinct gladiatorial diet. An analysis of remains associated with gladiators at Ephesus points to a pattern heavy in grains and legumes, with evidence consistent with a mineral-rich plantish drink. That does not give every Roman school one universal menu. It does show that these bodies were managed for performance and recovery. The same is true of medicine. Galen, one of the best-known physicians of the ancient world, worked with gladiators at Pergamum. His own account of his results is still his own account, not an audited survival table. But his presence shows that serious medical attention could sit inside the operating system of a school. And that raises an obvious question. Why spend heavily repairing someone who is expected to face weapons again? Because by this point the owner has already spent heavily creating him. A novice is one kind of risk. An experienced fighter is another. The novice may never become useful. The veteran may already carry training, reputation, and several successful appearances inside one body. This is where the school's name begins to matter. A sponsor can advertise a known fighter. The public can recognize a record. A returning veteran can become more valuable than a first-time entrant. Later Roman price regulation makes that difference explicit by allowing a higher valuation for an experienced free fighter who enters again than for a first-timer. Experience is not just a memory, it is part of the price. Now place that veteran beside a novice in your courtyard. One has eaten for weeks without earning. The other may be the reason the sponsor came to your school at all. Both need guards. Both can be injured. Both can refuse to perform. But only one has a name the city may already know. The novice is replaceable in the abstract and expensive in the present. The veteran is profitable in the present and difficult to replace at all. Put too many novices on the notice and the event looks weak. Put every famous fighter into one afternoon and the school risks too much at once. That looks like strength. It is also concentration. If one famous fighter carries a large share of your reputation, then one damaged body can weaken the entire school's next event. The more valuable he becomes, the more carefully you need to manage the thing that made him valuable in the first place. Repeated survival. This is the point where the school starts looking less like a warehouse full of fighters, and more like a roster balanced on a few fragile people. And that problem is not only financial. A school is improving the combatability of people it must also keep under control. The most famous warning comes from Capua. A school associated with Lentulus Batiatus held the men later connected with Spartacus. The surviving literary accounts were written long after the events and do not agree on every detail. Appian gives a figure of roughly 70 escapees. Plutarch emphasizes confinement and the owner's injustice. You do not need the later military campaign yet. The business problem is already visible at the gate. The school took people with reason to resist, concentrated them in one place, and trained them to become more dangerous. The better the training works, the more serious a failure of control becomes. Keep that in the background, because before the school can collapse from the inside, it still has to make money from the outside. The sponsor has chosen the event, the notice is being painted. Now he needs fighters. Men are selected from the yard, their equipment is checked, The school has to move them from a guarded compound to a public arena without losing control before the fight even begins. Empty rooms remain behind, waiting for men who may return injured, celebrated, permanently disabled, or not at all. The sponsor does not necessarily want to buy your entire roster. He wants temporary access to enough men to fill the spectacle. You want to supply them, collect the payment, and bring them back. The exact arrangements varied across time and place. Fighters could be hired, sold, owned by wealthy patrons, or managed by specialists. But the central commercial advantage of a school is repeat use. One trained fighter can appear more than once. One recognizable name can be advertised more than once. One period of training can support several future payments. That is the optimistic version. The trouble begins when the sponsor wants something the owner cannot safely guarantee. The crowd expects credible danger. The sponsor needs the event to matter. A visibly timid fighter can embarrass the school and weaken the spectacle. A contest that looks completely safe loses the uncertainty that gives it power. So the owner cannot simply protect every fighter from harm. The fighter wants to survive. The trainer wants the techniques to hold under pressure. The physician wants enough of the patient left to repair. The sponsor wants a memorable event, and the crowd wants to believe that what it is seen can end badly. Those interests meet at the arena gate, but they do not point in the same direction. This is why trained matches were dangerous without being automatic executions. The evidence includes fighters with repeated appearances, surrender, reprieve, and careers long enough to build reputations. Death was real. Permanent injury was real. But survival happened often enough for experience itself to become a product. Now follow one fighter through the event. His name has been painted on the wall. He has eaten from the school stores. He has trained with specialists. His equipment has been prepared. Guards move him out of the compound. The owner has spent money for weeks or months before this walk. The sponsor has paid to place him before the crowd. The fighter enters the arena carrying two kinds of value: the value of today's spectacle, and the value of every future spectacle he might survive to perform. The school cannot collect both if the second one disappears. At this point, most modern viewers make one of two assumptions. Either the owner wanted maximum blood because that sold the show, or the fights must have been mostly safe, because trained people were expensive. Neither answer fits the system. If the danger is fake, the sponsor's product weakens. If the fighter is destroyed, the school's future earning capacity disappears. The business lives in the space between those two failures. And Roman law gives us one of the clearest surviving pictures of how that risk could be priced. The jurist Gaius describes gladiators supplied for a spectacle under terms that change depending on what happens in the arena. He is explaining a legal classification problem, not publishing one universal market tariff. But the structure is precise. For every fighter who leaves the arena safe, the customer owes 20 denarii. For every fighter who is killed or permanently disabled, the customer owes 1,000 denarii. A survivor is treated as hired. A fighter who cannot return is treated as sold. The same person enters under one agreement. The outcome decides what kind of transaction it becomes. In Gaius's example, permanent loss costs 50 times temporary use. That is not a bonus for producing a better death. It is the price of consuming the supplier's future. The sponsor rents the performance. If the performance destroys the performance, the sponsor effectively buys the loss. Now every part of the school changes meaning. The meals are not background detail. They protect a body that may earn again. The physician is not an optional luxury. He stands between temporary injury and permanent loss. The trainer is not merely teaching combat. He is increasing both market value and replacement cost. The school's reputation is not attached to the walls. It is attached to people who can disappear in one afternoon. And the contract reveals the owner's deepest problem. The arena can make a fighter famous and destroy him in the same event. That does not make every survival profitable. A fighter can return injured, unpopular, or unable to perform at the same level. A school can still misjudge a recruit. A sponsor can still choose another supplier. But the direction is clear. The durable operation needs enough fighters to come back, recover, and remain worth hiring. Picture the return to the school. One man walks through the gate with a new victory attached to his name. Another is carried into the medical room. A third sleeping space stays empty. The owner has received payment for the event, but the real result will not be known until he sees which part of the roster can be offered again. That is why the settlement from one afternoon and the health of the next roster are the same story. This is where the market begins to push back. By the late 2nd century, gladiatorial supply had become expensive and politically important enough for Roman authorities to regulate prices. A bronze inscription associated with Italica preserves part of that effort. The text is damaged in places, and some details are debated, but the broad structure survives. Fighters were placed into economic tiers. Prices were limited. Lower-cost supply was addressed. Portions of payments were assigned. One provision distinguished a first-time free volunteer from a returning veteran, allowing the experienced man a much higher valuation. Imagine the sponsor looking at the same roster the owner sees. The owner sees months of training, risk, and reputation. The sponsor sees a public obligation becoming more expensive with every famous name added to the notice. Price control enters because both sides can be rational and still push the market toward a political problem. That is not a complete profit and loss statement for every school. It is something more useful. It proves that Rome had a priced market for experience, that suppliers could become expensive enough to burden sponsors, and that public authorities were willing to interfere with what the school could charge. So even a successful owner does not control the business around him. He can train the fighter. He cannot create unlimited demand. He can build a reputation. He cannot guarantee permission. He can negotiate with a sponsor. He cannot stop the state from changing the rules. And he cannot make one experienced fighter easy to replace. This is the moment to return to Capua. The school associated with Gladiators did not lose its roster because public appetite disappeared. It did not need a price cap to become vulnerable. Its failure came from the people inside the compound. According to the later accounts, a relatively small group escaped. That number mattered because the school had done its work. These were not random men walking away from an ordinary labor site. They were people being trained for organized violence, held inside a system built on coercion. The institution had created capability without consent. Once the gate failed, the loss did not stop at missing future event payments. The owner lost the people, the training invested in them, the reputation attached to them, and control over the danger he had helped create. The later revolt became far larger than the school, but the economic lesson is contained in the first moment. A gladiator school produces a more valuable roster by making controlled people harder to control. That is a structural risk no amount of bookkeeping can remove. Walls can slow escape. Guards can watch doors. Discipline can suppress resistance for a time. None of those things changes the basic arrangement. The school depends on people accepting, enduring, or failing to escape a system that treats their bodies as commercial supply. And as Roman spectacle grew larger, more expensive, and more politically important, the state moved closer to that supply. The clearest physical image is the Ludus Magnus in Rome, built under Domitian near the Colosseum. This was not an ordinary private yard. It was an imperial complex with its own practice arena, housing, and a direct connection toward the amphitheater. Archaeological interpretation suggests it could hold an enormous number of gladiators, perhaps around 1,000. Look at what that connection means. The fighters do not move from an independent business through the city and into someone else's venue. At imperial scale, the school becomes attached to the arena itself. Training, housing, security, scheduling, and spectacle begin to look like one state-controlled system. That gives the imperial administration advantages a private owner cannot match: reliable supply, direct access, greater control over scheduling and security, less dependence on one outside operator, more control over a form of entertainment that carries enormous political visibility. Private schools did not vanish everywhere, and no single policy turned the entire Roman world into one centralized system, but the direction matters. The more important the spectacle becomes, the less comfortable the state may be leaving its supply entirely in private hands. So, does owning a gladiator school work? It can, but only when several conditions remain true at the same time. Sponsors must keep buying. The law must keep permitting. The roster must contain usable matchups rather than impressive headcount. Trainers must turn recruits into credible performers before their maintenance cost outruns their value. Enough veterans must survive to carry reputation forward. Food, security, equipment, and medicine must keep functioning between events. And the owner must contain the very people whose danger makes the product valuable. Miss one event and you lose revenue. Lose one novice and you lose sunk cost. Lose one famous fighter and you may lose demand. Lose control of the roster and you lose the business itself. That is why the courtyard from the beginning is misleading. The walls are visible. The armor is visible. The drills are visible. But the school's value does not sit in any of them by themselves. It sits in a chain that has to remain unbroken. A sponsor willing to pay, a fighter worth advertising, a match the crowd believes, a body that survives, a physician who can return it to use, and a gate that still holds when the fighter comes home. You thought you were buying a place that teaches men to fight. What you are really buying is the burden of turning human danger into repeatable supply, without letting the spectacle, the state, or the people inside the school take the system away from you.